The purpose of this video is to go over some of the ethical issues that researchers face and that you might face when you do your research project, either your master's thesis or your doctoral dissertation. First, what we have to understand is what ethics are and how they fit into the scope of things. So ethics is a branch of philosophy. In terms of research, where that plays into roles is that ethics has to do with conducting research, and we'll talk about the rights of the participant, publication of research or dissemination, and then plagiarism or use of others' materials. Each of those we'll talk about further. Major principles of ethics is a big thing that we're going to highlight here. The first being competence. You have to be a competent researcher. And what that means is you have to understand the basics of conducting research in an appropriate manner. That's one of the major reasons you're required to take a research methods class in graduate school, is because you can't conduct research without having an understanding of the basic tenets of sampling and reliability and validity, which we'll cover later in the semester, or survey design, or the scientific method. Second is integrity, the extent to which you make the right decision at the right time. As we'll discuss in class, there are just a lot of opportunities to make bad decisions when doing research. So trying to, really holding yourself to the standard of making the right decision at the right time, even if it's not in your best interest, in terms of finishing your thesis on time or what have you. Professional, scientific, and scholarly responsibility we'll talk about a little bit further. Respect for people's rights, dignity, and diversity. When conducting research, just being aware that we need to be non-exploitive, non-discriminatory. Again, we'll hit those kind of in the next slide. But then the last one, and this is one that's one to think about, is research, when done right and when published, has a big effect on where we move forward. For the longest time, there was research out there that described that there was a relationship between vaccines and the development of autism, which has been debunked because the author lied in his paper. He adjusted his data such that that wasn't going to be the case. So major changes happened to the world because of these couple of papers, and that is where, as a researcher, you are responsible for being, having integrity so that we don't hurt the world, essentially. And where we kind of meet up with those principles is through these ethical standards. Again, these are ones that you really need to know. These are very important. Competence is knowing the basics of research. You're going to have to know competence both in your content, and that's what you're going to do through the development of your review of literature, and in conducting research, and that's what you do through the basics of this class. The use and misuse of expertise based on your field or content knowledge. You need to make sure that you are only doing your research project within the expertise range that you have. Fabrication of data is when you omit data. Falsification of data is when you adjust or fake data. And plagiarism is when you take other people's ideas. Avoiding harm, the goal is when we conduct research, we want to set up a methodology that we do not believe will injure people or will minimize the amount of harm. There might be some studies that will have some things like, finger pricks or will take blood, but we minimize the chance that this could harm an individual. Non-discrimination, your study should not be developed in a way that would discriminate towards any one group of individuals, or the findings would then discriminate. Non-exploitation, you can't be specifically coercive of special populations. For instance, there are a lot of safeguards in place for doing research with children, doing research with pregnant women, doing research with people in the military, doing research with prisoners, because all of these special populations have situations that could potentially lead to coercion. Harassment, you can't, people have the right to withdraw. They don't have to do your study or any part of your study. So you have to just let them do that. Public communication, one of the things, and this goes with the next line of confidentiality, Almost all research requires at least that you provide that all subjects will, the names will be remain confidential. Ideally, you would make the studies anonymous if possible. As such, when you communicate about your project to others, either in paper format or in an interview or in discussion with friends, you don't talk about who participated in your study. And then informed consent, which we'll hit in a few slides. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the history right now because some of this is covered in the movie that we're going to watch in class, but history, a lot of where we are today is a result of bad ethical choices made in the past. The first of which really came out of the Nuremberg trials post-World War II, when the Nuremberg Code was developed in 1947. This was in response to the Nazi experiments that were done in the concentration camps, and the Nuremberg Code was the first attempt to develop ethical standards for research involving humans, where it was 10 conditions on how to work with humans. Unfortunately, this was not all that was needed. There were still a number of things that happened. In 1932 was the Tuskegee syphilis study. This is where researchers wanted to examine the long-term effects of untreated syphilis. They did this with relatively low socioeconomic status, low-educated black men, did not tell them that they had given them syphilis, and therefore it went untreated, and studied them over a period of time. Clearly, we can just identify the horrible ethical decisions there. One of the ones that will be talked about in the movie is the Stanley Milgram reaction to authority study, where individuals had to shock other participants who were being asked questions, and they were being quizzed. If they answered the question wrong, they were shocked. The participant themselves did not see the person they were shocking, and they were just told to keep shocking by an authority figure until 2/3 of the participants actually were shocking past a level that was considered fatal to the participant, the other person. Turns out that the other person was just a actor and part of the study, but the fact is that the study basically, had some very strong mental effects on watching a person having a hard time saying no to a researcher because they were considered an authority figure. In 1964, the Helsinki Declaration by the World Medical Association created guidelines for doing medical research. This has been since updated in 2000 as one of the major guidelines worldwide about conducting research with human subjects. In 1974, in the U.S., Congress passed the National Research Act, establishing the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This was followed up by the Belmont Report, which is a required reading for this class. Made 3 major principles from that report that you should know, and not forget. Respect for persons' rights to know the nature and the purpose of the study and their right to give or withhold consent to participate. The concept of beneficence, where the idea is to protect a person from harm, maximizing the benefits to the participants in the world through the research, while minimizing the harm to the participants. And then finally, respect for subjects' privacy through the idea of confidentiality or anonymity. The Department of Health and Human Services then created the Common Rule that came out of the Belmont Report. The Common Rule basically led to what we have now, which is our institutional review boards. In what the Common Rule said was one of the major parts was the protecting human subjects. Essentially here it's the right to privacy, which is the confidentiality or anonymity seen in the next part, or non-participation, meaning that if they decide to withdraw at any point, there is no possible penalty for them. Additionally, there is a right to expect experimenter responsibility. That means that the experimenter is going to be competent in the content area, competent in conducting research, and competent in keeping them safe. And then finally, the informed consent elements that we're going to go over in a few slides. Now, the Common Rule also helped to establish the institutional review boards. These are committees established by the federal regulations. They exist at all research institutions across the country to protect human subjects from abuses through prior research and through a review of proposals. Every one of you who will be doing a thesis or independent study or dissertation will have to go through an IRB review. And what the IRB review does is it examines the methodology of your study to ensure that what you're doing is you're keeping your subjects or participants safe and you're not harming them in any way. The link to our IRB is below through PrideNet. It's a division of our academic affairs, and we have different ways that, on campus, people review your methodology to make sure that you are keeping people safe. Now, the informed consent is an important component. Essentially, the informed consent is a contract between you and the participant where participants are given adequate information to be able to voluntarily consent to a study before participating. In most of the research that's done here, you're giving them a description, sometimes brief, sometimes longer. If this is like a physiology study and there's going to be blood draws, you have to give more information. That gives them enough information to know whether or not it's safe for them to study. In a few situations where deception is required, you can withhold some facts, but the idea is that you would do a debrief at the end so that they have all the information by the end of the study. In the informed consent form, usually there's a general statement of the background of the study and its objectives, an explanation of the procedures, usually relatively brief, a description of any risks or potential discomforts, a list of potential benefits, offer to answer any inquiries, instruction that the participant is free to withdraw at any time. That means they can walk into the lab, say hello, turn around, and walk out, and there's no problem. If they're filling out an inventory, a questionnaire, or a survey, they can skip any question, and there is no problem with it. Which is that first question. In the case of questionnaires, they can deny specific items or questions. An explanation of the procedures to be taken to ensure the confidentiality of the data of information will be derived to make sure that, we're not just leaving these papers around. They should be in locked cabinets, they should be stored on password-protected computers, etc. And you may not contain any waiver of experimental responsibility. There is no way that you can say, if the person gets harmed, it's their fault. If they get harmed, it's your fault, and you could get sued. Now, the next step, typically, in doing after you do the research, is to try to disseminate the findings through publication. A common way of seeing that ethical issues is you want to make sure that you always report the results truthfully and honestly. If you made mistakes through the course of your study, you own up to them. You identify if there was a typo and you omitted a question or what have you. However, what sometimes happens is we have people who are rushing to get papers done, make bad decisions, and they might engage in plagiarism. They might engage in fabricating the data, so omitting data that doesn't help them, falsifying the data by altering data, providing inaccurate documentation of the sources, or they might fail to report results that are discrepant with their initial goals. These are all things that can lead to problems later. The 7 major areas of academic dishonesty are the plagiarism, so using your own ideas, or using ideas and writings of others and pretending they're your own. Fabrication and falsification, which is making up or altering data. Non-publication of data, which is called cooking the data. Faulty data gathering procedures, So you want to make sure that you're consistent for every single person. Poor data storage and retention. Make sure you keep it in a locked up computer or a locked up office. Misleading authorship. The order of authors on a published article tells you who did a lot of the work. Every once in a while, big name authors try to strong arm their way to continue to be top authorship. And then sneaky publication processes. This is called ghost authorship, where somebody else writes the paper but a big name is put as the author. These are more common at big research institutions. Then we have the copyright issue, knowing what is fair use. There is a video on Moodle that you should read, or you should watch to see about issues related to plagiarism. Essentially, this bottom point is the important point. If you are unsure, ask, because the last thing you want to do is get hit with the copyright infringement. And what can happen? Well, if it's scientific misconduct, that can lead to sanctions. So those are a bigger deal. If it's scientific mistakes, that leads to remedial activities. Those are usually just sort of learning processes, slap on the wrist. Why do these things happen? People have pressure to publish. That's very common if you're a faculty member. In order to get tenure or promotion, expectation is that you publish, and people are working under deadlines. For you, it's trying to complete your graduate work before a period of time. In order to get a May degree next year or 2 years from now, if you're looking for a PhD, you have to defend by March of that year. That timeline can feel pretty crunching. If you have a grant, those are usually awarded every year. If you don't get a certain amount of work done, they won't be rewarded. And then there's also the desire to get awards and such. Any of these things could lead to reasons why people make bad decisions. Ultimately, the lesson of this class is just do the right thing and stick to the integrity part. Alright, we'll cover the rest of it in class. Thank you.